Hello everyone, I'm your host MX2, and today we'll be going over the release log for Boxcutter 719_6 in addition to Boxcutter 719_5. For this, there will be one feature that is not like the others. It will be one of our classics being returned finally in this era of Boxcutter. However, I'm most excited for Wedge and the improvements that we've seen there. In addition to that, we'll be talking about some of the sort bypass adjustments. But the majority of things done for this update are 3.1 fixes and compromises in order to get things to work properly going forward. It's really given us a moment to reflect as far as what we want our goals to be. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it, begin talking about what's new in Boxcutter. So here I am in Blender 3.0. However, I'm using an older version of Boxcutter. I'm using 719.3. So this version is not the latest, meaning that when I draw a box, we see that something undesired happens. We see that not only is the modifier not set up, the lattice is left behind, and the box didn't even appear in the location it was supposed to. So if we try another cut, we see that it just gets more and more complex without us even getting anywhere close to the desired result. So for that reason, anytime that you run into an issue, the first thing you should always check is if you are up to date. And the easiest way to do that is just by accessing your marketplace of purchase, and you'll see that there is a newer version than the one that you're currently using. So now we're back in 3.0. However, this time we have 719.6 installed, meaning that whenever we draw a box, everything's going to behave the way that it's supposed to. So now we're able to get to work without any issue. No weirdness happening, at least initially, whenever it comes to using Boxcutter with Blender 3.0. So for this update, Boxcutter now has the ability to bevel individual points. So here I am using Ngon to just begin drawing a shape. And I'm just going to right click in order to stop the draw. And we're now in this 2D pause state. So basically by holding middle mouse button over a point, I'm able to bevel this individual point, and we can now bevel individual points inside of Boxcutter. However, we're also able to bring the points all the way in and turn it from a bevel to a chamfer, but only on the first point. Another thing is that the way that we're doing point beveling in this version of Boxcutter compared to versions that we had in 2.79 is that we're using weight. So basically, you cannot bevel a point larger than the largest weight that you already have defined, which basically will define the value of basically 1. So it's kind of complicated to explain. However, as you work with Boxcutter, it'll become a little bit more apparent. So now that we have a few points beveled on this and points that are not, we can just begin extruding this. And just like that, we're now able to draw out points and bevel them inside of Boxcutter. So to emphasize a little bit more about what I was talking about with certain points not being able to be beveled larger, let's just draw a shape and then pause it. We'll move this point so that way it's straight. And we want to bevel this point. So we're just going to start off beveling it, but we only want to bevel it a little bit. And you see me bringing it in to turn it from chamfer to a bevel. And we'll bevel this point as well. And these areas are kind of tight with their geometry. However, let's say that we want to bevel this. Well, we see that despite all of my efforts, the weighting that we're able to give this is not able to exceed the initial bevel value that was given in order to make this area possible. And that's because of our order of operations that was being performed. But let's say that we did want to make this work and we want to give this a really large bevel, or really let's give this one a really large bevel because that one would make more sense. So let's press B in order to bevel, and we can press B again in order to cancel, and we'll press tab in order to pause. So from here, I'm just going to bevel this point so it's something large, and then we can go back and bevel these points to a lesser degree and a smaller level of weight than what we have relative to this. So this is actually our starting point for what we're dealing with whenever it comes to the bevel. We're hoping that as time goes on, we'll be able to offer alternative solutions to making this even more efficient and better. But for now, this is our initial implementation of bringing back bevel to Ngon, which is a bit of an event for us. So we'll middle mouse button, rotate our view, bring this down, extrude it, click and apply. And just like that, you now see that we have bevel as part of Ngon for individual points inside of Boxcutter. It also goes without saying that you are able to basically draw a shape with Ngon like you see me doing now, and then still drag the bevel dot in order to bevel all of the points, in which you see me able to drag it in from a bevel to a chamfer. But we're also able to middle mouse button over individual points and adjust our individual weights in the event that we need to get something a little bit more precise now. So the systems that we had previously are able to be used in conjunction with the new ones, and as we improve our ability to redistribute the weights between the points as users make changes, it'll become even more versatile and allow you to get even more interesting combinations when it comes to your bevels. A very strange bug was also brought to our attention, where basically if you were to press backspace with your mouse hovering over a point, it would actually cancel out the shape. So I'm just showing that that issue has actually been resolved as well, and you're able to now continue drawing your shape even with bevel active and no longer have an issue with your shape being canceled out at a time when you're in the middle of working on it. So we have been also working on the point system as a whole to improve its stability for Blender in general. So previously in Boxcutter, whenever it came to drawing a wedge, you could simply just press D, and there's an option in the sidebar where you could simply enable wedge to be your default shape start state. So whenever you draw a shape, it automatically gets a wedge. And then we added the ability for users to hold down Control in order to basically draw a perfect wedge. So in the event you're just trying to get a perfect, nice wedge that actually sharpens nicely, then just holding down Control in the middle of the extrusion of your wedge is the easiest way to get a perfect wedge. And this is kind of a play on the custom behavior we have of holding down Control in order to basically get the perfect extrusion. So if we hold down Control, we see that we're able to snap it to the perfect depth. However, now we actually have auto proportion with custom to the point that it actually just snaps to it by default, which just makes our lives a lot easier whenever it comes to custom. But going back to box and wedge, so we're talking about wedge and we're talking about how we can draw a shape and we can hold Control in order to basically just snap it to what we consider the perfect wedge. In fact, if you press W, you can toggle the wedge to be off and on. You can actually toggle the wedge between its alternative angle, but really this is the type of wedge that we're going for. In this update, we added the ability for users to toggle on something called laser cut proportional wedge, which means that when you have this option on as part of wedge, anytime that you just draw a wedge and you hit spacebar, it will just draw a perfect wedge. So this is the quickest way to make a wedge, just letting users know that making a wedge that's perfect is now easier than ever, and you can just simply draw a shape, not extrude it, and it will just jump to what is considered the perfect wedge. And this is something that I personally wanted to be on by default. However, for its initial implementation, I felt that users probably should get acquainted with it and see what it offers them as far as their wedges go, because if you're adding wedges as much as I am, then you definitely realize that, you know, maybe there's a better way than even pressing Control at all. And, you know, even though I'm pressing spacebar to quickly apply, I don't even have to do that. I could just draw the shape, just click one more time in order to execute without extrusion, and just like that we are just drawing perfect wedges all over this shape, which just gives us such a nice transition of surface compared to just having simple box extrusions going down. But just like that, you can now enable an option to get perfect wedges inside of Boxcutter on every draw, no matter what. So Boxcutter, just like HardOps, if we expand the behavior palette and we go under the drop down under the sort area, we see that there's now an ignore flag that has nothing, which indicates space, and then we have a stop flag which has an underscore. This will now add more versatility whenever it comes to sort, because when you add an ignore, that means that you can basically make one single modifier be ignored by just putting an underscore at the beginning of its name. But you can make a series of modifiers be completely ignored from a point onward by basically having an underscore at the beginning. So to show this in action, let's press Q with our cube selected, and we just add a bevel using HardOps. And if we just draw a box cut and we perform a cut, we see that this cut happened where it placed a boolean before the bevel. And as a result, the cut that we added received a bevel to be added. So if we were to just jump over to bevel and we add an underscore, this basically will set us up to have it be stopped, meaning that from this point forward, it's just going to stop whenever it gets to the bevel in the stack. So let's just perform a cut. It pretty much looks the same way as if it were using the ignore flag, except that ignore is more of a personal thing. So to show this in action, let's go under add modifier and we put an array on it. And so now we have two objects. Or we have one object that's now being arrayed twice. So we see that every time we cut, the object is having the array placed at the very end of the stack. But let's say that we wanted to drag this all the way up here, where basically it receives only the first Boolean cut, then it's arrayed, then it's beveled. But because we chose to use an underscore, it's actually flagging it to not do anything to it beyond that point. And what I mean beyond that point is from this point onwards up the modifier stack, we can consider these modifiers locked in to the point that sort will no longer change them, and it'll only append modifiers later on in the stack. This sort of override is really needed for advanced modeling and for keeping things non-destructive even longer without having to mess with your ability to scroll things or render things properly. So it really is a major expansion on sort, and you'll be hearing more about it as time goes on with why these are there. But just in case you ever need to just stop sort from just messing up your stack, you can just simply put an underscore at the beginning in order to stop that particular modifier from being touched, or put an underscore if you just want it to be ignored. So with that, just introducing the new capabilities with sort inside of Boxcutter 719.6. So here I am in 2.83 using 719.1, and if we draw out a box and press tab to pause it in a 2D state, we could press D, and using the helper we can just toggle grid. We see that right now the grid is looking rather unacceptable, and that is because our solidify is in a positive value. But once we take it to negative, we see that the grid is now looking perfectly fine. So we're now able to extrude, click and apply, and just like that we have performed a grid cut. However, in Blender 3.0, one of the things they did was change the direction that solidify worked. So if we were to basically draw this box and we press tab, even though it's extruded, we see that now in order to get the solidification to behave properly, we now have to drag it in the positive direction, versus if we have it in a negative direction, it's now going to look rather unacceptable. So this is part of one of the fixes that we had to do for this latest update, but if you're using the latest version, the grid cut should definitely behave as expected whenever you're using Blender 3.0, but if you are using something out of date, it may look quite wonky. So whenever you're using Boxcutter, normally you're drawing a cut that's using the red shape, but if you press I, you can turn it into an inset. This button right here is for toggling live mode, which typically when you're working, you're able to use the luxury of live mode. However, in the event that you're not able to, you can just toggle it off at the top bar. So now whenever we draw a cut, we see that it's no longer performing live, letting us know exactly what's going on. However, if we press I, we can switch over to inset, and if we press spacebar, we've performed a secondary inset. However, let's try that again, and we'll press I to jump over to inset. But if we were to press T in order to adjust our thickness, we see that for some reason it cancels, and it's because you can't adjust the thickness of something that doesn't exist, and because of the way that pause mode works, the cutter isn't actually created at the time that it normally is whenever live mode is happening. So it always resulted in you just having your cut being canceled out versus it just performing the operation. So let's just minimize this, and now we're in the most current version of Blender using 719.6, and if we were to first press D and turn off grid because we don't need it, we can just draw our cut just like normal before. We could press I, go over to inset, we could press T to adjust our thickness. But in the event that things were so choked out with our computer that we're unable to get anywhere with it, we would need to be able to press pause in order to get into pause mode. And then whenever we draw our cut, we could press I for inset, we could press T, and we see that T no longer stops the operation from working. We see that T actually does nothing because adjusting the solidification isn't actually possible at this point in pause mode. But you are able to basically press tab to pause it, press D, and go in and adjust your thickness in the D panel for some reason. And from here, if in the event that you're in pause mode, you're able to then perform your inset operation. So we've made inset just a little bit easier for users to perform whenever they're in pause mode, which just comes in handy in the event that you're just under so much strain that you're unable to have things perform in live mode, and you need to perform the operation at a specific depth in pause mode. So whenever it comes to Boxcutter, you're able to draw a shape, and then in the middle of your operation, you can press Shift T in order to basically perform a taper. Alternatively, you can pause it, and just by shift dragging the extrusion dot, you can also adjust your taper in the middle of your draw in the event that you just want to taper it on the fly, in addition to adjust your extrusion amount. But there was never a way to actually cancel your taper once you had it initialized. I mean, you could go into Helper by pressing D and then just clicking the X in order to just remove that. But in the event that you wanted to just remove it on the fly without having to bring up the helper, there's actually no way to do that. However, in this update, we made it where basically pressing Shift T in the middle of adjusting taper will now cancel out taper and bring you back to an untapered state of being. So here I am in an older version of Blender with an older version of Boxcutter. And to show this example, I'll need to create a couple of cuts. So first we'll create a cut here. And of course we'll trim this with a wedge, go for a perfect wedge, adjust our auto smooth, maybe press D, switch over to our circle, press J in order to join, we'll extrude this over to the other side, go back to box, extrude while pressing W in order to turn this into a wedge, and we'll just create a couple more wedge cuts in it just to make it interesting. And so by pressing D we could draw a box, but I'll press W to get rid of wedge because I don't need it. And so if we perform this extrusion but we press Y, we're now going to extract this surface, meaning that we're extracting this, we've made it a custom cutter, and we're going to be reusing it on our next drawing. So if we draw and we press Shift tilde, we've basically rotated this shape inside. This is different than Control R, which is rotated 90 degrees, but this version doesn't actually have rotate 90 degrees. It only has rotate inside, which is on Shift R or Shift tilde. So the issue is that if you were to rotate this shape 90 degrees and then draw it, it'll retain that information of remembering that it was in a rotated state the next time you draw it, which results in you not getting a very accurate drawing the next time. So we're drawing the shape, but this time let's press Shift tilde once to rotate it. So now we have the shape this way, and when we extrude it, we see that the shape doesn't actually come out one-to-one the way that we would normally want it to in proportions whenever it comes to custom cutter. And the worst part is that the subsequent draw also has this as the state. So that means the next time you draw it, it will also come down in a non-one-to-one state looking terrible, and you draw it again, it keeps coming down in a non-one-to-one state, and there's no way to actually get it out of this rotated inside state unless you're aware to pause this shape and press Shift tilde, which I feel is a little bit of a gotcha. So this is something that I wanted to see resolved inside of Boxcutter. So now let us bring up our most current version, and we're just going to set up that scenario again and then discuss it. So I'm just going to cut a box. We'll draw another box, but this time we'll wedge it. We'll wedge this area too. We see that our wedge is set to 0.5. We'll set that back to 1 just so things are logical with our wedge. And let's switch over to circle, and we're just going to jump off of this area and just extrude it to the other side. And let's switch back over to box. And I'm just drawing shapes, pressing W to turn them into wedges. I shouldn't even hold control to get a perfect wedge anymore based off of what I talked about previously, but you know, old habits, right? So we're just going to extrude this, or extract this, sorry. We'll extract this, press Y, grab this, and we'll repeat it here. And if we press Shift tilde, we see that we're now drawing this out in a inside rotated 90-degree way. So that means that it's not actually precise with the way that we extracted it, which is kind of problematic. But with a boxier shape, you wouldn't mind repeating it like this and actually rotating it inside of its bounds. But with circular shapes, this is definitely more of a pain in the neck, which is why I'm precisely showing it with a circular shape at this time. So let us just draw this shape. And the best part is now the next time we draw the shape and we press Control R, we're now rotating it 90 degrees. When we press spacebar, we're getting a perfect circular shape because it doesn't retain the information of having it rotated inside previously, which is the way that we had it. And you know, sometimes you don't actually want that. Sometimes you want to retain the purity of your shape in order to get it to come out exactly the way that you extracted it. So sometimes if a user gets confused with that, it could get a little bit problematic, especially if you drew one shape that was incorrect, you performed an undo, and then from there when you attempted to draw it again, you would just use rotate, then you would be able to actually get the shape to come out exactly the way that you wanted it to, instead of having to go through all that rigmarole of remembering to press shift tilde or shift R to rotate the shape inside back the way that it was supposed to be. So here I am in 2.83.18, which is what I refer to as my EN, because the splash screen is EN. It's classic, but I still love this version of Blender. And we're using Boxcutter 719.1, so it's also an older version of Boxcutter. If we press N, we can bring open the N panel, and basically we can jump to the panel that's designated for Boxcutter, which will have the help. And one of the first things in the help to notice is that it lets us know that we need to select a mesh to cut. Otherwise, we're just going to be drawing world shapes instead of actually drawing a cutter on the shape, which requires that we have it selected. The focus of this is the help. So the help is something that we've had for a while, and we've tried to add in all the hotkeys and additional functions that we've added to be talked about at relevant points. And to show that in action, let's turn on snapping, and we now have dots. And we see that a new option was added, basically control to enable snapping. So by holding control, we're now able to use snap dots on this particular mesh. However, if we click on grid, we see that we now have the grid, and we're able to bring up the grid and use that. And basically the help is telling us to hold control to use these snappings. However, in the event that you decide you want to try to use the static grid or static dots, we'll switch to static grid in this case. We see that whenever we hold control, there are quite a few hotkeys. And these hotkeys aren't necessarily in the best order for usability whenever it comes to users. For example, we see that, pressing spacebar will pause the grid, and spacebar will unpause or unfreeze the grid. But align A was showing at the very beginning when we were holding control and still just tracing around the surface, which if we were to press A at the time that we are bringing the grid up, it makes no sense for us to actually have A showing. And also left click to confirm operation and right click to cancel. These shouldn't actually be showing because an operation hasn't yet been started. So just showing that, the help tells you about everything that you're able to do with static grid, but it isn't telling you about it in the most optimal order for you to do whatever it is that you want to do. In fact, we see right here that control right click allows us to basically extend the grid. We can hold shift in order to extend it in a very specific direction. Anytime the border turns black, that means that the grid is stuck up on screen. We see that we're able to press G in order to grab. We can press shift in order to move it freely without having to snap it to individual grid units. We can press R to rotate it, but we can hold control and actually snap our rotation to grid units whenever we're rotating. So there's a lot that we're able to do with it, in addition to pressing tab and getting rid of it, which is also the purpose of spacebar. So now let us jump over to the latest version of Boxcutter and talk about how help has been refined. So let's first just turn off everything. We'll go in and make sure, static dots is off as well. And if we press N, we can use the N panel and jump over to Boxcutter. And we see that, basically the same thing as what we were talking about before, except when we hold control, we see that same thing. When we bring up the grid, the same thing, except now it'll display the unit size. So whenever you roll the wheel up and down, it'll tell you what the unit size is. Over here in the help panel, in the event that you do not opt in to having Boxcutter notification showing, which we don't have a notification for grid size changing. So specifying that the grid size has changed anywhere is an improvement. Also, it's at the bottom. So now let us jump into the nitty gritty of things. So I'm just going to enable static grid, and we see that the static grid format has changed. And this is because the issues that we had before where irrelevant items that weren't needed are no longer showing. So let us just press tab in order to pause it, and we see that the help is a lot more focused, a lot more consolidated, and there's no longer issues with irrelevant information showing. A is at the bottom for align, which is something that we never talk about, but just so you know, if you hover over a face and you press A, you can actually realign the grid to that area in the event that you have it in a pause state. So if I just shift and roll the wheel, which is basically using subdivide, then we can just press A and it will basically realign the grid over that particular area. We also see that whenever we're in this mode that the items that we are able to use are the only things that are listed right now. For example, Shift K will activate knife project. So it's harder to use because I'm holding control at this time, but if I hold shift and I press K, we've basically knife projected this mesh, and you can't actually see it at this time, but if we were to press Alt V and enable wireframe, you can see that basically the grid has been knife projected geometrically into this mesh. So that part is actually working the way it's supposed to. However, I'm going to press Ctrl Z a couple of times just to get rid of it. Typically, whenever I use knife project, I will have the grid in a pause state, get it precisely where I want to, maybe look at it in a view that's actually advantageous to the operation at hand, and then from there press Shift K in order to perform the knife project operation, which is now specified in the help at a more opportune time. We see that, pressing tab or space will freeze the grid, so we can try that out by just pressing tab, and then we see that more options are now available to us. So whenever it comes to static grid, it's not really that complicated. However, I could see how the previous way that help was formatted in the way that it was maybe not the best way to convey the information to users as far as what this grid has to offer. So just for those who are new to Boxcutter, we have two different types of grid. We have our classic grid, which basically I refer to as a spider's web. Basically, you roll the wheel, you hold control, you're able to bring it up. You can also click this lock icon, which will let you press control, and the grid will remain up on screen. And we also see that in the event that you are in a locked grid state, that it will notify you that pressing escape will disable snapping. So in the event that you do not want your grid to no longer align to where we have it aligned on this face, like for example, we're actually looking at this face perpendicular to the view, so the grid is actually a little bit weird. However, we can still basically draw a cut and attempt to make this work and then go through and perform the operation, even though we're looking at it at such a perpendicular view that it's just not working out for us. But we can just rotate the view, grab this grab dot, and move things. And because we have grid lock on, whenever we grab the draw dot, we see that the grid actually comes back without me having to hold control. And this is also reflected in the help, but we also see that whenever you draw a shape, that there's a lot more help to be conveyed whenever it comes to dealing with shape things. So grid is no longer even in the running, but there has been improvements with the help in the way that it conveys this information. So if you are new to Boxcutter, definitely try expanding the end panel, and using the help should help you get around a lot easier. So here I am back in my back in my 2.83.18, using classic Boxcutter 719.1. So if we have snapping enabled for object mode and we weren't in snapping grid, we just have grid, we're drawing cuts, we're having a good time, we're just working, and we were to say go in edit mode with tab. I'm a big fan of using Boxcutter in edit mode. Sometimes I have Boxcutter open in both object mode and edit mode. And one of my favorite things about Boxcutter is that you can actually work destructively in object mode and non-destructively in edit mode, and vice versa. So sometimes I will be working non-destructive in object mode, as you see in the top bar, but in edit mode I will have destructive checked. So when I tab in and out, we can see that destructive and non-destructive have basically this differential. And so if I'm in object edit mode and I'm just cutting, we see that everything that I'm doing is real deal cutting. So there's nothing to really have to ponder with it. I'm able to just cut, do my symmetries, and grab edges and bevel them and basically work in edit mode. However, one of the things that always drives me crazy is the snapping differential. If you have snapping on in object mode, it is going to be on in edit mode, and vice versa if you have it off. If you have it off in edit mode, it's going to be off in object mode. But where it comes into being an annoyance is that if we were to select this point at the end and we try to hold control, we see that that's just not going to work because we have the grid in the way. So if I try to select this point, we're now performing an extrusion, which is just annoying. This is problematic. So I always find myself either turning off snap so that way I can select my points and just control click between them, or I just press W to just exit Boxcutter altogether. But really, I don't like changing my preferred settings for object mode just because of choices I want to make in edit mode. And so this is what I refer to as snap mode differential. So let's bring up our most current version of Blender, and to just set up that same example, we're just going to put ourselves in grid, or actually let's put ourselves in grid, sorry, and we'll select these two edges and just press Ctrl B to bevel them. And now we have Boxcutter open in edit mode, so let's go ahead and just set that to destructive, so that way we just are able to just get to work, just making very destructive changes to this mesh and watching them, reflect and take place. Also using mesh machine symmetrize in order to get the geometry adjacent in edit mode. Also, I don't even have to be holding control for this extrusion. I could basically use this toggle and hit spacebar to draw a perfect wedge without having to use control anymore. Old habits, they die hard. But the best part is I can tap into object mode and begin drawing cuts, and these cuts aren't destructive. These cuts are non-destructive, meaning that I can apply them with C# or Smart Apply and basically keep modifying them and moving them around because they're object mode decisions versus me going in and making these edit mode decisions, which I feel are a little bit more intimate because I'm actually looking at the mesh and the geometry. But that probably is a little bit too much over explanation. But to show in action, if we look at object mode, we see that I have a grid. I can bring up a grid, I can perform my cuts, I can press T, solidify it, do all that good stuff. But when I go into edit mode, notice that now I'm able to have grid off because there's now a separate setting monitoring it for edit mode. So this means that I could just press 1, go into vert mode, select a point, control click in between, and no longer have grid actually getting in my way. And so this is something that really drove me crazy in the past and was just one of those things that was on my to-do list to get resolved someday. And that day is actually now. So I'm very happy to announce that there's now a differential with edit mode and object mode whenever it comes to snapping, which should prevent the issues that occur when it comes to misclicking in selection. So over the course of this video, we talked a bit about how grid has some differences with its default dynamic and static counterpart. For this update, we also wanted to add one additional thing to static grid to just help set it apart. And if we go to static grid, notice that the moment that I switch from dynamic grid to static grid, that we get a lot more toggles whenever it comes to static grid. And that's because static grid's a lot more special, a lot more customizable. So if we click on the drop down, we see most of our typical options. However, there's now an option for toggling the floor overlay. So if we toggle the grid overlay, this means that whenever we bring up the grid, it actually gets rid of Blender's grid. So you can see it disappearing whenever we hold control. We can press tab and it just locks in place. We could shift right click in order to extend this grid out, and then when we press escape, the grid actually comes back. So really that's all that option does. However, when it comes to the floor is something that isn't counted as part of that grid. However, if you toggle this option, we see that the grid floor is also capable of disappearing. So if you want only one grid to roll them all during the time that you're actually just using the static grid by itself, this is the option for you. So really it's nothing fancy. It's just a way for you to toggle the floor overlay in addition to the grid overlay whenever you hold control to bring up the static grid. Also delineating the static grid from the classic grid is the grid mode color, which is a classic, but if you ever want your grid to be reflective of the operation that you're starting in, red for cut, if you have it under green, that means you're in join mode. If we set it to be purple, then you already know that it's inset time. But in the event that you want to customize your static grid, these options are still available and are still being expanded. So just letting users know, always in front is always good. In the event that you want your grid to always be in front of your view, for example, we have this grid paused on this particular face, but it's not showing its intersection that's happening with the rest of this mesh, and this curve is sitting on top of it. So if we toggle that off and we turn off, or actually not auto transparency, always in front, we see that now the grid is actually obscured by the mesh that remains. So in the event that we draw a cut, we could press tab, press E to extrude it out, and we're basically cutting that area off. So just a way to visually see what's going on whenever you're using static grid a certain way. In fact, I'll press tab to pause this, E in order to extrude it the opposite way. And just like that, we're able to use this grid to kind of slice this area out. So here we are back in 2.83, running the EN 719.1, so it's an older version. This is something that always drove me crazy. So we're going to take this cube, SZ, and then we're going to press D, change over to circle, and look at the circle that just came out. This is how the circle comes out, and it's because the scale didn't get applied fast enough whenever we began drawing this cut. And so because we have unapplied scale in object mode, I'm telling you, this thing happens so much and it drives me crazy. However, we see that once you go in and you draw it the second time, it's actually fine. So let's right click and cancel. Let's just scale the cube back up. And this time we're going to draw, and we see that we're back to the same position because we're not able to apply the scale fast enough for us to perform this operation. This is something that's been resolved in the latest version. I'm so happy about it. It drove me crazy. So we're just going to scale that down, not even apply it, cut, press B, roll the wheel in, shift F to flip it, click to apply, and we're done. Just like that. So to show it again, we're going to just scale it back up, not even apply it. We see that the scale over here is unapplied. So we're just going to begin drawing the circle, and you see that the circle does not have to be canceled and redrawn, which is something that used to happen to me all the time. It would drive me crazy, and I'm just glad to say that now scale will be applied fast enough whenever you're working with an unscaled object.